And we're back. A few political ads have already started to hit the airwaves as we get closer to the midterm elections. It's something that people in many states have their eyes closely peeled on. And Dr. Tom Schwartz is here with us. We've been talking about Ukraine. There are other foreign policy issues that might be on the minds of Americans when they vote. But closer to home, there are some big topics that people are concerned about right now. I mean, the economy in one way or another is affecting all of us, no matter what your income level is. Right. Is that going to be the biggest driver in what's on politicians' minds as they really rev up campaigns?
I think it is. You know, there's a famous, of course, expression coined by George Stephanopoulos in the Clinton campaign back in 1992 that it's the economy, stupid. They were focusing on the economy to defeat George H.W. Bush, who was a very successful foreign policy president, had conducted the first Persian Gulf War very successfully, had a very successful record there. But the economy went into recession, and that led to his defeat. And I think in this case, what you've got is a situation where no matter how much control or lack of control the president has, he's going to be blamed for whatever happens in the economy. Now, on some levels, the economy does look good in the sense of employment and jobs. It certainly looks better than it has in many years. But the scale of inflation, which is a sort of a universal tax and which takes away the wage gains that workers have made because of the shortage of employees, that's just going to be crippling. And this is, in this sense, it's very reminiscent of the 1970s and the degree to which inflation really affected elections throughout that decade. And in that sense, I think things would have to change really dramatically, or there'd have to be a dramatic other type of crisis for things not to be, for the economy not to be the number one issue.
Number one. So based on the forecasts of what you're seeing as far as inflation goes, and Janet Yellen, you know, what she has said.
Right.
Do you find that before the midterm elections, anything could happen to take the blame off of, say, President Joe Biden and his party?
It's unlikely. I mean, under almost any circumstances, even to the extent that that the inflation has been aggravated by the war in Ukraine, it's just impossible for a president to escape that. The Arab oil boycott in the 70s was not something that a president really could affect and change, and it still ultimately undermined the Republican Party during that time in the congressional elections. So I can't see that. Now, the thing that's interesting, there are some interesting, the House of Representatives, at least according to most of the forecasts, does look like it will flip to the Republicans. There are enough contested races. The Republicans are close in many, and most of the forecasts do have a Republican victory. The Senate is where it's much closer because the map largely favors the Democrats. Most of the seats are up in states that were won by Biden, that are generally Democratic, and so even Politico's estimate there is somewhere, or the Real Clear Politics estimate there is still only a very narrow possible for the Republicans there. So that might be the one consolation prize, might be that they could hold on to the Senate rather than if they lose the House, that they still might have the Senate.
I think it was 4 years ago. It's easy to lose track of time when you were at home for 2 years, right? 4 years ago for that midterm election, we heard a lot about immigration. We heard a lot about border issues. We heard a lot about that in Tennessee, even in a state that doesn't is hundreds of miles away from Mexico. Is that going to be something that you at all think will be on any minds this year? I know you talked about foreign policy. It does sort of relate to that.
Connected to that. It's the Summit for the Americas was held this past week, and this was a summit of a large number of Latin American countries with President Biden, and one of the resolutions for it was to try to deal with immigration and migration problems that are coming at the southern border. Now, the southern border is generally an issue that the Republicans have emphasized greatly. You know, it's a constant on Fox News. It's a constant in political rhetoric, and it may have an effect, certainly in states that have a Senate seat up, like Arizona or New Mexico, where there's also, and Nevada, where there are states that are on the border. But it might have even a broader impact in the sense that if you see the administration, or if the numbers of migrants continue to grow, and then there's an attempt to disperse them in the United States, which has been discussed, you could see it affecting states like Tennessee. We don't have a Senate race coming up. We only have we have a congressional one, and Nashville is one of the interesting districts because it would flip a Republican or a Democrat to a Republican, given the way the city has been now divided. But I think the border and questions about the border and proper policy could certainly be there. Not quite maybe with the intensity they had in 2018 or elsewhere, but it certainly was going to be one of the issues.
You mentioned that Nashville's congressional district looks a lot different.
Right.
How interested are you in seeing how this plays out?
I think it's very interesting because the Republicans clearly are seeking to get an additional seat in Tennessee, and they had an advantage. The only two Democratic seats were one in Memphis and one in Nashville that Congressman Cooper had. The way they've divided the district now, Cooper ended up just feeling like he could not win in this context. So there's still a lot. Nashville is still, as a city, generally Democratic, but whether it'll be outvoted by the way the city has been divided now and whether a Republican will win, I think most of the forecasts are that there will be a shift, and you will see. And then the real question is which Republican will win the primary to have the chance to take the district.
Really zooming out again, as we have you here to talk about foreign policy, any other big foreign policy issues do you feel like are on people's minds? China, any other Russian-related issues?
Well, I think China certainly is on people's minds in different ways, and certainly could be on their mind were China to act in any sort of form, particularly against Taiwan. Now, that would certainly raise all sorts of issues. The president has gotten into trouble a little bit by claiming we are going to defend Taiwan and then walking it back, but that would certainly be a major issue were anything to happen. On the other hand, the other issue with China, and this is something that could be politicized, is the question of whether the tariffs will be removed from many of the goods that the Trump administration put on tariffs. Now, those tariffs are generally thought to drive up the costs of some of the goods from China. Now, and the Biden administration has suggested that it might want to remove some of those in order to deal with the inflation issue. The problem is that removing those tariffs without getting certain concessions from China might also then politicize the issue and make it something that could be argued about in foreign policy in the election.
Tricky.
Very tricky issue for them.
How do you advise people at home to make sure that they have all of these subjects covered and on their minds when they go to vote?
Well, I think people in the end on voting, I don't advise anyone on voting in general, because I think you vote. Voting is in part both an issue where you're thinking rationally about issues, but there's also emotional questions, usually in the connection with candidates, sense of how the country's doing. I think one of the biggest indicators is whether people feel things are going well or not going well. And if they're not going well, they generally don't vote for incumbents. That's one of the ideas, is that you need a change. And I think 2022 is heading into, even with all of the polarization, it's heading into a situation where most of that slice of voters who are not as committed partisans, that slice that is not huge anymore. I mean, there's a pretty sizable base on either side of the spectrum, but that slice of people who do call themselves independents are probably reflecting the view, which you see in the surveys, that things are not good in the country and that we need a change. And that, I think, is likely. And in a way, midterm elections almost always go against the party in power. 2018, Trump took a very bad beating there in Congress. And 2010, Obama, after winning a major victory in 2008, lost almost 60 seats in the Congress. So that certainly does happen. And it's a repeated thing in American history, and it usually reflects a certain unhappiness about where things stand.
I was going to say, Tom, just go to any gas pump and do my job, and you'll hear a lot of bummed out people.
Yeah. The gasoline crisis is again, this is something so reminiscent of the political crises of the 70s that I've studied historically and have written about myself. And the degree to which inflation or people's immediate, it's such an immediate thing, and so many people are affected by anything to do with gas prices that it's a very key barometer of what will happen in an election.
Do you catch yourself looking 4 years out, or 2 more years out, or do you just keep your eyes on the midterm elections?
A little bit of 4 years out, because I do think one of the most intriguing things is whether we're in a situation where we might have a replay of 2020, namely Biden against Trump again, which I think would be very depressing to many people, seen as, why can't we move past these octogenarians, essentially? Why can't we move to a younger generation? And I think that's going to be one of the more interesting calls after the midterm, is whether it looks like we're going to have a replay of 2020, which I think a lot of people would find very ominous and depressing.
I'll be quite honest. I know that he's going to be here, President Trump, on Friday for an event at Gaylord Opryland. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we know that that's going to be happening. I don't know too many of the details, but I do know those billboards were up around town for an event that did not happen, and it did say, I think, Nashville loves President Donald Trump.
Right.
Do you, as you watch him in the political arena still, do you see the size of crowds saying anything about his chances in a couple of years?
Well, I think he's still the dominant figure in the Republican Party, and so if he wants to run and if he wants to get the nomination in 2024, he can get it. The real question might be whether there'll be any erosion of his support among Republicans that would enable someone like Governor DeSantis of Florida, or former Vice President Pence, or someone to challenge Trump and to actually try to weaken him in the primaries and actually try and prevent him from getting the nomination. Right now, I don't think that's the case. I think he still has the support of most Republicans, although the January 6th hearings are going to lay out, or seem to lay out, a pretty convincing case of his refusal to accept the verdict of the election and his encouragement, at least maybe with a wink and a nod, of the violence that took place at the Capitol.
Any discussion about possible meddling in this election? We've been talking about Russia in other ways tonight. Any concern about that?
I think not. And I think the interesting thing is, one of the things the Ukraine war has at least exposed is that the scale of Russian ability to really influence has been more limited in this case. They're still using it, and they still do it in minor ways. There was an article today about Russian attempts to weaken morale among the Ukrainians by broadcasting misinformation about the possibility that women would be called up into the Ukrainian army and things like that were designed to create a sense of desperation. So they're still doing it. It's just that their ability, it seems, and this is partially also, I think, an aspect to do with our own ability to counter cyber warfare and the degree to which the American government has gotten its act together to try to counter disinformation, that I think the idea of meddling by Russia on the scale that we thought happened in 2016 or in 2020 is not going to happen.
We will still get emails to the News Channel 5 newsroom from time to time, rallying people together to be observers at polling places, to look out for these domestic issues at the polls. What do you think that's about, that people are still trying to do in this groundswell of making sure elections are fair?
I think this is a product of what has been this incredible division within the country that is so close, and particularly in some states where it these battleground states where the difference was only a very small percentage. And then the pandemic, of course, which encouraged a lot of new measures in voting, mail-in voting, and a lot of looser rules in order to allow people to vote safely. All of that contributed. And then, of course, I think this is something that's been created in part by Donald Trump, but the argument that there is a real problem of voter fraud. And enough people listen to him that now has become a theme and an issue, even though the evidence for large-scale voter fraud is non-existent. So I think I'm not surprised, but I think it is a reflection of the tightness of election races that you've got more people now worried about the validity of the vote and the accuracy and the possibilities of fraud. So I do think we're going to have to live with that for a while.
Are we just as divided as I felt like we were a year or two ago, or has it gotten better, worse?
There's a study that's been looking at this, and that there's Vanderbilt, one of the Vanderbilt political science, trying to numerically look at it, and it's clear that division actually in American history is actually far more common than consensus, and that if you actually look at American history, the relative moments of quote-unquote national unity or decline are relatively few and far between. There's usually a great deal of division. The scale or the intensity of partisanship today is probably unique, although there have been times in the past, and certainly if you go back in our history, Civil War and other times, you know that this has been part of our history. I think it's interesting, though, as I mentioned about Ukraine, you can have bitter partisan divisions on some issues, and then people can come together on others. The Senate's ability to actually carve out a compromise bill on gun legislation. Now, that's still early, it may not pass, but even the fact that they could do that shows that maybe the divisions are not quite as deep and profound as people think.
What a great example. Maybe intense, but not as great as they've shown in the past. All right, we're going to take another break. Give us a call if you want to talk to Dr. Tom Schwartz. We got another 20 minutes or so. That number is 737+. We'll be right back.